Contestant's joke turns dark. Steve Harvey immediately stops the show. Everybody uses humor to cope. It is one of the oldest human survival mechanisms there is. You laugh so you do not cry. You crack a joke so nobody sees the cracks underneath. Most of the time, it works. Most of the time, the laughter covers the pain well enough that nobody asks questions. But on a Tuesday afternoon in December 2024, a 27-year-old man stood on the Family Feud stage and made a joke that started out funny and ended somewhere so dark that Steve Harvey stopped the show. Not because the joke was inappropriate, not because it crossed a line, but because Steve Harvey, a man who had spent his entire life understanding comedy, recognized something in that joke that nobody else in the studio caught. He heard the pain hiding behind the punchline. He saw the truth buried underneath the laughter. And in that moment, Steve made a decision that the man standing in front of him mattered more than the game, more than the ratings, more than anything else happening in that building. What Steve did next saved more than the show. It may have saved a life. Before we go any further, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. This is a story that needs to be heard, and you are going to want to stay for every single second of it. The Lawson family from Nashville, Tennessee walked onto the Family Feud stage like a family that was ready to have the best day of their lives. They were loud, they were energetic, and they were funny. Genuinely, naturally, effortlessly funny. The kind of family that lit up a room just by being in it. Their matching orange shirts had Lawson Legacy printed across the front in bold white letters, and from the moment they took their positions behind the podium, the audience was already smiling. You could tell this was going to be a good episode. You could feel it in the air. What you could not feel, what nobody could feel, was the silent storm that was raging inside the man standing second in line. The family captain was a woman named Sandra Lawson. She was 53 years old, a registered nurse who worked in the emergency department at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Sandra had been an ER nurse for 26 years, and those years had given her a composure that most people mistook for toughness. She was not tough, she was steady. There is a difference. Tough people build walls, steady people build bridges. Sandra was a bridge. She connected people to the help they needed in their worst moments, and she did it with a warmth that made terrified patients feel safe and a precision that made experienced doctors trust her completely. Standing next to Sandra was her son, Marcus Lawson. He was 27 years old. He was the reason they were on the show, the one who had submitted the application, organized the family, and spent 3 weeks convincing everyone to take the trip to Atlanta. Marcus worked as an IT support specialist at a healthcare company in Nashville, a job he described as fixing computers for people who think the computer is broken when it is actually just unplugged. He was the family comedian. He had been the funny one since he was old enough to talk. His kindergarten teacher had written on his report card that Marcus made the class laugh every single day, and that had never changed. Through elementary school, through high school, through college, through every job and every relationship and every phase of his life, Marcus was the one who made people laugh. It was his identity. It was his armor. And it was the thing that was slowly, invisibly killing him. Marcus had been diagnosed with clinical depression 4 years earlier. The diagnosis had come after a period that Marcus later described as falling into a hole so deep I forgot there was a sky. He had withdrawn from friends, stopped answering phone calls, and spent entire weekends in his apartment without eating or showering or opening the curtains. The only place where he functioned normally was at work and at family gatherings, because those were the places where he performed. He put on the smile. He cracked the jokes. He made everyone laugh. And then he went home and sat in the dark. Sandra knew about the diagnosis. She had been the one who finally convinced Marcus to see a doctor after she noticed that his humor, which had always been warm and self-deprecating, had started to shift. The jokes were darker. The self-deprecation had an edge to it that felt less like comedy and more like confession. She recognized the pattern because she had seen it in the emergency room more times than she could count. People who were drowning did not always scream for help. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes the laughter was the loudest just before the silence. Marcus had been in therapy for 3 years and on medication for 2. He was better, genuinely better. He had not had a serious depressive episode in over a year. He was sleeping. He was eating. He was seeing friends again. The hole was not gone. It never fully went away, but he had learned to live with it rather than in it. The Family Feud appearance was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone, proof that Marcus Lawson was not just surviving anymore. He was living. The third member of the team was Sandra's daughter, Keisha, who was 30 and worked as an elementary school music teacher. Keisha was the family's emotional center, the one who cried at commercials and hugged people for 2 beats longer than most. She was fiercely protective of Marcus. and she was one of the few people who knew the full extent of what he had been through. She had driven him to therapy appointments when he could not make himself go alone. She had sat outside his apartment door on the nights when he would not let her in, talking through the door until she heard him talk back. The fourth member was Sandra's brother, Calvin, who was 49 and worked as a mechanic. Calvin was the family's rock, a quiet, sturdy man who showed love through acts of service rather than words. He had taken Marcus fishing every Saturday morning for an entire year during the worst of his depression, not because Marcus enjoyed fishing. He did not, but because it got him out of his apartment and into sunlight for a few hours. Calvin never talked about what he was doing or why. He just showed up every Saturday at 7 in the morning with 2 rods and a thermos of coffee and said, "Let us go." Marcus later said those Saturday mornings saved his life, and Calvin later said he knew that, which was why he never missed one. The fifth member was Marcus's best friend, Jordan, who was 28 and worked as a bartender. Jordan was the only person outside the family who knew about Marcus's depression. He had figured it out on his own, the way close friends sometimes do, reading the signals that Marcus thought he was hiding. Jordan had never confronted Marcus about it directly. Instead, he had simply started showing up more texts, more invitations, more late-night phone calls about nothing in particular. He created a net of presence around Marcus that was so consistent and so casual that Marcus did not even recognize it as a safety net until years later, when he was well enough to see it for what it was. The Lawson family was facing off against the Rivera family from Austin, Texas. The Riveras were a warm, competitive family who matched the Lawsons' energy beautifully. Both families hit it off immediately. Steve Harvey came out and within 30 seconds was laughing at something Marcus had said. "Oh, we got a comedian," Steve said, pointing at Marcus. "This is going to be a good one." Marcus grinned and said, "Mr. Harvey, I have been practicing my whole life for this moment. Everything I have ever done has led to this podium." The audience laughed. Steve laughed. Everyone was having a great time. Nobody knew that the funniest person in the building was carrying the heaviest thing in the room. The game was outstanding. The Lawson family played with an energy and cohesion that made them a joy to watch. Sandra gave strong, confident answers. Keisha was solid and steady. Calvin, despite claiming he was not built for television, delivered 2 answers that landed on the board and earned enthusiastic applause. Jordan contributed a clever response that made Steve do a double take. And Marcus was the star. He was everything a Family Feud contestant should be: quick, funny, engaging. Every answer came with a delivery that was half comedy performance and half genuine game play, and the audience was eating it up. During the second round, Steve asked Marcus what he did for a living. Marcus launched into a 2-minute riff about working in IT support that was so funny Steve had to call a timeout because the audience would not stop laughing. He talked about the time a coworker asked him to fix a printer that turned out to be a microwave. He described a phone call where a man insisted his computer had a virus because the screen was black, and Marcus had to explain that the computer was turned off. He was performing at a level that had the studio crew shaking their heads in amazement. Several audience members later said it was the funniest thing they had ever seen on the show. But Sandra was watching her son with the trained eye of an ER nurse who had spent 26 years reading the difference between the surface and what was underneath. She noticed that Marcus's humor was getting bigger, louder, more manic. The jokes were coming faster and with more force, as if he was building a wall of laughter between himself and something else. Sandra had seen this before, not in the ER, in her living room, in her son's apartment. In the months before his diagnosis, when the humor had become so aggressive, so relentless, so desperate for a reaction, that it stopped being joy and became a shield. The game moved into the later rounds and the Lawsons were ahead. Everything was going well. Then Steve read a question that shifted the air in the studio so subtly that only a few people noticed. "We surveyed 100 people. Name something that keeps you up at night." It was a standard Family Feud question. Most people would say stress, bills, their phone, a baby, or noise. It was Marcus's turn. He stepped up to the podium and, without missing a beat, delivered his answer with the same quick-fire comedic timing he had been using all day. "My own brain," Marcus said, and then he added, almost like an afterthought, delivered with the throwaway rhythm of a comedian burying a punchline in a parenthetical, "because it will not shut up and it is not always saying nice things." The audience laughed. Of course they laughed. Marcus had said it funny. He had delivered it with a shrug and a self-deprecating grin, the way comedians deliver dark material, light enough to land as a joke but honest enough to feel authentic. The board lit up. "Your own thoughts" was on the board, number 3 answer, 17 points. The audience clapped. The game moved on, but Steve Harvey did not move on. He had been looking at the board when Marcus gave the answer, and when he turned back, he was smiling, ready to react with his usual comedic commentary. Then the words hit him, not the surface of the words, the weight underneath them. My own brain, it will not shut up, and it is not always saying nice things. Steve's smile held for about 3 seconds, long enough for the audience to think everything was normal, long enough for the game to feel like it was continuing. Then the smile began to fade, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way a light dims when the current starts to weaken. Steve looked at Marcus, really looked at him. And he saw something that his years in comedy had taught him to recognize, but that most people never learned to see. He saw a man who was telling the truth and disguising it as entertainment. He saw a cry for connection dressed up as a punchline. Steve did not react immediately. He filed it away. The game continued. Marcus gave 2 more answers, both delivered with the same rapid-fire humor. Both funny, both loud. Both slightly too fast, like a man who was afraid of what would happen if he stopped talking. Then, during a brief pause between rounds, Marcus made another joke. It was directed at Steve, and it was delivered with the same breezy, throwaway style. Mr. Harvey, you know what the best thing about being on this show is? For the first time in months, I actually want to be somewhere. He said it with a laugh. He said it like it was a compliment wrapped in a joke. The audience took it that way. They chuckled. They applauded, they moved on. But Steve Harvey did not chuckle, he did not applaud, he did not move on. Steve stood very still. His card was in his hand, but his hand was not moving. His eyes were locked on Marcus with an intensity that the people in the front rows noticed immediately. Sandra noticed it too. She saw Steve's expression change, and she saw in his face the same recognition she had seen in her own mirror 4 years ago. The recognition that something was wrong. That the laughter was louder than it should be, that the humor was working too hard, that the funniest person in the room was the one most desperately in need of being heard. Steve turned to the production booth and said quietly but clearly, I need to stop the game for a minute. The producer's voice came through Steve's earpiece, but Steve was already setting his card down on the podium and walking toward Marcus. Whatever the producer said, Steve was not listening. He had made his decision. The game could wait. This could not. Steve Harvey walked over to Marcus and stood directly in front of him. Not at the podium. Not at his hosting mark. Right in front of this 27-year-old man, close enough to have a private conversation, except the microphones meant nothing on that stage was private. The audience had gone quiet, sensing the shift in energy, but not yet understanding what was happening. Marcus, Steve said, and his voice was the voice he used when the comedy stopped, the low, serious, unpolished voice that the audience had learned to associate with moments that mattered. I need to talk to you for a second. Marcus's smile was still on his face. It was automatic, it was reflex. The corners of his mouth were turned up and his eyes were performing the muscle memory of happiness that he had perfected over 27 years. What is it, Steve? You want some more jokes? I got a whole set prepared for the drive home. Steve did not laugh. Marcus, you said something a few minutes ago. You said your brain will not shut up and it is not always saying nice things. And then you just said that for the first time in months, you actually want to be somewhere. Steve paused. Those are not jokes, Marcus. I know comedy. I have been doing comedy for 35 years. And I know the difference between a man who is being funny and a man who is using funny to hide something that is not funny at all. The smile on Marcus's face flickered. It did not disappear. It flickered. The way a light bulb flickers right before it goes out, he tried to recover. Come on, Steve, I was just playing. That is what I do. I joke around. Everybody knows that. Steve shook his head slowly. Everybody knows you are funny, Marcus. Nobody is questioning that. You are one of the funniest people I have ever had on this stage. But I am not asking you about your comedy right now. I am asking you about you. Are you okay? The studio was absolutely still. The Rivera family was standing on their side of the stage, watching with expressions of quiet concern. The audience had stopped moving, stopped whispering, stopped everything. 200 people were watching a game show host ask a contestant the question that everyone in that young man's life had been afraid to ask directly, not because they did not care, but because Marcus had made it so easy to believe the laughter was real that nobody wanted to look behind it. Marcus stood there. His smile was still technically present, but it was losing structural integrity, collapsing from the inside like a building whose foundation had been cracked. He looked at Steve. He looked at his mother. Sandra was standing behind the podium with her hand pressed against her mouth and tears sliding down her face because she had been waiting for this moment for 4 years, not dreading it, waiting for it, praying for it, the moment when someone other than her saw through the performance. Marcus, Steve said again, gentler now. I grew up using humor to survive. When I was living in my car, I told jokes. When I was broke, I told jokes. When I was so scared of failing that I could not sleep, I told jokes. Because if I could make people laugh, they could not see how much pain I was in. And it worked. It worked for years until it did not, until the jokes stopped being enough and I had to face the thing I had been running from. Steve paused. I am not your therapist. I am not your doctor. I am just a man who recognizes the routine because I used to do the same one. Marcus's chin trembled. The smile was gone now, and what was underneath it was something the audience had never seen because Marcus had never let them see it. It was exhaustion, not the kind that comes from a long day. The deep bone-level exhaustion that comes from performing your own happiness for so long that you have forgotten what the real version feels like. I am tired, Steve, Marcus said. His voice was small, stripped of every layer of performance, the voice underneath all the voices he used on stage. I am really, really tired, Sandra broke. She moved from behind the podium and went to her son. She did not say anything. She just put her arms around him and held him. Keisha was next, pressing her face against her brother's shoulder and crying quietly. Calvin walked over and placed his heavy, grease-stained mechanic's hand on the back of Marcus's neck, the same hand that had held a fishing rod every Saturday morning for a year, and he stood there like a wall between Marcus and the rest of the world. Jordan came last. He stood beside his best friend and put his arm across Marcus's shoulders, and in that gesture was every text message, every late-night call, every casual invitation that had not been casual at all. Steve Harvey stepped back and let the family hold each other. He gave them nearly a full minute of uninterrupted time, which in television terms was an eternity. Then he spoke, not to Marcus, but to the audience and the cameras. I want to say something to every person watching this right now. There is someone in your life who is doing what Marcus just did. They are making you laugh so you do not see them cry. They are performing joy so convincingly that you have stopped checking if the joy is real. They are the funniest person at the party and the loneliest person in the room. And they need you to do what I just did. They need you to stop laughing for 1 second and ask, "Are you okay?" Not casually, not in passing. They need you to stop, look them in the eye, and ask the question like you actually want to hear the answer. Because sometimes the funniest people in the world are just the saddest people with the best material. The audience gave a standing ovation that was not about entertainment. It was about recognition. It was 200 people standing up because they were thinking about someone in their own lives, the friend who was always cracking jokes, the family member who always kept things light, the coworker who always seemed fine and wondering for the first time whether they had ever really asked. Steve turned back to Marcus. Marcus, I am proud of you. I am proud of you for being here. I am proud of you for being in therapy. I am proud of you for taking your medication. And I am proud of you for just saying out loud on this stage that you are tired, because that took more courage than any joke you have ever told. Marcus wiped his eyes and, because he was who he was, managed a small, genuine smile, not the performance smile, the real one, smaller, quieter, but honest. Steve, I have to be real with you. This is not what I expected to happen on Family Feud. I thought I was going to come here and be funny and win some money and go home. I did not think I was going to have a therapy session on national television. A small laugh rippled through the audience. Marcus's timing was still perfect, even now, especially now. But I am glad it happened, because you are right. I have been doing the routine for a long time, and it feels good to take the costume off for a minute, even if it is in front of 200 strangers and a man with the best mustache on television. Steve laughed. A real, warm, relieved laugh. Boy, do not come for my mustache. That is the one thing I will not let you joke about. The game resumed, and the Lawson family won. They played fast money and took home $20,000. Marcus answered 3 of his 5 questions with responses that landed on the board, and he delivered all of them with the same quick wit that had defined his performance all day. But there was a difference now. The laughter he drew was different. It was not the loud, explosive laughter of an audience being entertained. It was the warm, knowing laughter of people who had seen behind the curtain and who were now laughing with Marcus rather than at his routine. It was a better kind of laughter, a kinder kind, and Marcus could feel the difference. When the episode aired 7 weeks later, the clip of Steve Harvey confronting Marcus became one of the most impactful pieces of television that year. It was viewed over 70 million times in the first 2 weeks. But the raw numbers did not capture what made this moment different from every other viral clip. It was not the shock value. It was not the drama. It was the quiet precision of what Steve Harvey had done. He had watched a young man hide his pain inside his talent, and he had gently, respectfully, carefully pulled the talent aside and said, "I see the pain. And it is okay." The mental health community embraced the moment immediately. Therapists, counselors, and psychologists across the country began referencing the clip in sessions and training seminars. The concept of comedian's mask, the phenomenon of using humor as a defense mechanism against depression and anxiety, had been well documented in clinical literature for decades. But Steve Harvey had demonstrated the concept on live television in a way that academic papers never could. He had shown millions of people what it looked like in real time, the too fast delivery, the too loud laughter, the jokes that were slightly too dark to be entirely innocent, and he had modeled exactly how to respond. Not with alarm, not with intervention, with a simple, direct question. Are you okay? The National Alliance on Mental Illness reported a significant increase in calls to their helpline in the weeks following the episode. Callers specifically mentioned Marcus's appearance as the reason they were reaching out. A spokesperson said, "What Marcus Lawson did on that stage was extraordinary. He showed people that you can be the funniest person in the room and still be struggling. He showed them that asking for help does not mean the humor goes away. It means the humor gets honest. And honest humor, as Marcus demonstrated, is even funnier than the performative kind." Marcus himself became, somewhat reluctantly, a spokesperson for mental health awareness. He was invited to speak at events, contribute to articles, and participate in campaigns. He accepted selectively, always on one condition: he got to be funny. "I am not going to stand on a stage and be a sad story," he told one event organizer. "I am going to be a funny story about a sad thing, because that is who I am." The difference is that now people know the sad part is real, and the funny part is how I deal with it. Both things are true. Both things can exist at the same time. His most impactful appearance was at a college campus event where he spoke to 3,000 students about depression, comedy, and the cost of performing happiness. He opened the talk by saying, "I am Marcus Lawson. You might have seen me on Family Feud, where I had an emotional breakdown on national television and Steve Harvey had to hug me, so that is my brand now." The students laughed. Then Marcus got serious, or at least as serious as Marcus ever got. "I spent 4 years hiding my depression behind jokes, and I was good at it. So good that nobody asked me if I was okay because I gave them no reason to ask. I was the entertainment. I was the relief. Nobody thinks the relief needs relief. But I did. I needed someone to see through the act. And it took a game show host who had been through it himself to finally say, 'I see you.'" He paused. "If you are doing what I did, if you are performing fine when you are not fine, I am asking you to let someone in. Not everyone, just one person. Find your Steve Harvey. Find the person who will stop the show for you." The line, "Find your Steve Harvey," went viral. It became a social media movement, with people posting about the friends, family members, therapists, and mentors who had stopped the show for them. The people who had looked past the performance and asked the real question. The hashtag was used over 4 million times in the first 2 months, creating a public conversation about mental health that was remarkable for its warmth and lack of stigma. Marcus's approach, honest but funny, vulnerable but never self-pitying, had given people permission to talk about their struggles in a way that felt accessible rather than clinical. Steve Harvey featured Marcus on his talk show 3 months after the episode aired. Marcus walked onto the set to a standing ovation and immediately said, "The last time I was on one of your stages, you made me cry. So if you pull that again, I am suing." Steve laughed. The audience laughed. And then Steve asked Marcus how he was doing, and Marcus gave an answer that would be quoted in mental health publications for years to come. "I am doing better, Steve. Not perfect. Better is not perfect. But I have stopped trying to be perfect, and it turns out that was most of the problem. I thought I had to be funny all the time. I thought if I stopped being funny, people would stop wanting me around. That is what depression does. It tells you that your value is in your performance, and if the performance stops, so does the love. That is a lie. The biggest lie my brain ever told me. Because when I stopped performing on your stage and just stood there and said I was tired, my family did not leave. They came closer. The audience did not boo. They cried. You did not cut to commercial. You asked if I was okay." Marcus paused. "Turns out the real joke was on my depression. It told me nobody would care about the real me. And it was wrong." Steve sat with those words for a long moment. Then he said, "Marcus, I want you to know something. That day on my stage when I stopped the game and asked you if you were okay, that was not me being a good host. That was me being a man who recognized himself in a younger man and who refused to walk away from what he saw. I spent years doing the same routine you were doing, making people laugh so they would not see me breaking. And I wish someone had stopped my show earlier. I wish someone had looked at me when I was 27 years old and said, 'I see the pain behind the punchline,' because it would have saved me a lot of years of suffering in silence." Steve looked at the cameras. "So if this reaches even one person who is hiding behind their humor, who is performing happiness because they are afraid the real version is not enough, hear me. The real version is enough. You are enough without the routine, and the people who love you want to see you, not the act." Calvin, the mechanic who had taken Marcus fishing every Saturday morning, gave one interview after the episode aired. He said very little because that was Calvin's way. but what he said stayed with everyone who heard it. People kept asking me why I took Marcus fishing every week for a year. They wanted some deep answer. There is no deep answer. My nephew was hurting. I did not know how to fix it. I am a mechanic, not a therapist. But I know that engines run better when they are not sitting idle, so I got him out of the apartment and into the sun. I put a rod in his hand so he had something to hold on to. And I sat next to him so he would know somebody was there. That is not therapy. That is just showing up. Anybody can do it. You do not need a degree. You just need to care enough to be present. Sandra retired from the ER 2 years after the episode. She said that watching Steve recognize what was happening with Marcus had confirmed something she had believed throughout her nursing career. You do not save lives with medicine alone, she said. You save them by seeing people, really seeing them, not the performance, not the mask, the person underneath. Steve Harvey saw my son that day, and in doing so, he reminded me that the most powerful thing a human being can do for another human being is to simply look at them and say, I know you are in there. And you do not have to hide. Marcus continued teaching, continued therapy, continued making people laugh, and continued being honest about the fact that all of those things existed simultaneously. He eventually started a podcast called Behind the Punchline, where comedians and everyday funny people talked about the relationship between humor and mental health. The podcast became one of the most downloaded shows in its category, not because it was heavy, but because it was funny. Genuinely, deeply, honestly funny. The kind of funny that comes from a place of truth rather than a place of hiding. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the Family Feud moment, he always said the same thing. Steve Harvey did not save my life that day. My therapist did that. My medication did that. My mother, my sister, my uncle, and my best friend did that every single day for years. What Steve did was something different. He gave me permission to stop performing. He stood in front of me on his own stage with cameras rolling and an audience watching, and he said, You do not have to be funny right now. Nobody had ever said that to me before. And hearing it from a man who understood exactly what I was doing because he had done it himself, that changed something inside me. It did not fix everything. Nothing fixes everything. But it made me believe that I could take the mask off and the people I loved would still be standing there. And they were. They always were. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Leave a comment below and check on the funniest person in your life today, because they might need to hear that they do not have to perform for you. Share this video with someone who needs to know they are enough without the routine. We will see you in the next one.